Well, um, why do you think drugs are illegal? Why do you think that?
Drugs are illegal because certain people in society, including community people, legislators, have recognized that people who can't handle the safe use of drugs do violent, dangerous things, destructive things to themselves and to other people. Drugs are illegal because people um, who drink and drive kill folks.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of folks. More people who drink and drive who kill people than all the use of heroin and cocaine combined. So as a society, we're against alcohol, tobacco, and then of course cocaine, heroin, and all that other stuff because it does bad things. That's why they're illegal. Whether or not prohibiting these substances, some drugs and not others, is the smartest public policy approach, I think, is another question. But I think there's just a knee-jerk reaction to ban or prohibit things that people view as being bad.
Okay. So do you think that that is really the reason why? It's because, like, because alcohol is not illegal.
That's
Obviously,
true.
they tried that already.
They did.
But how can they, like, I don't, like, alcohol is not illegal, but marijuana is.
Well,
So,
marijuana in many places, like say Minneapolis, a smaller marijuana is not a crime. It's a petty misdemeanor.
Okay.
And so I think that there's a growing recognition that all drugs are not equally lethal and harmful, and the criminal law has made some adjustments. But I think that you point out alcohol and tobacco, for instance. I mean, those do represent a strange anomaly in the law because if you were to tally up the deaths, for instance, I mean, alcohol and tobacco are by far the biggest killers, and they have the most legitimacy.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, alcohol and tobacco don't bring the instant death that, say, for instance, can be associated with crack use or something like that. But certainly not everybody who uses crack dies instantly, although some people have been known to. But I think it is an interesting anomaly, and I think that there probably should be greater controls over those substances, or more enlightened controls over the other substances, or maybe
Okay.
both.
Okay.
If you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I do. I was reading something about, like, when the drug laws first started coming out. I think it was 1970.
Well, the drug laws have been in effect ever since the beginning of the 20th century.
Okay.
There have been some form of drug control since that time.
Yeah, I don't remember what it was. I wish I had my notes now. But they were saying, like, they're classifying drugs into, like, schedules
Mm-hmm.
and, like, how addicting they were. So if something's really addicting, it doesn't have medical use,
Mm-hmm.
then you get more time in jail.
Well, I think that is what they tried to do.
They try and, like, base sentencing on how addictive a drug is.
Addictiveness and these sorts of things, how bad it is, and bad. Well, that's just a general, under bad you might have addictiveness, you might have, I don't know, any number of things that all amount to this is a bad substance.
Okay.
Well, certainly cigarettes got to be there.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's particularly interesting that the tobacco lobbies have resisted any sort of regulation at all, particularly in light of the new evidence that's come out that tobacco companies will manipulate the level of nicotine in the paper of the products and in the tobacco to make people even more addicted to their substances.
Uh-huh. Well, that kind of makes it more sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a lot more things involved than just being addicted.
Yeah, well, addicted and addictiveness, and also, just the impact on the body, also, but then there's a whole other question above and beyond what the actual drug does to the individual, and that has to do with the criminal law, because it's the criminal law that will create a black market or a white market. I think that's probably a more appropriate term for or an underground market for certain substances. Once you ban a particular substance, what you do is you don't stop the trade in that substance. You suppress it and force it to back alleys and places like that. Well, of course, then you start to drive up profits, because anytime you restrict supply of something people want, well, it's going to become more valuable. And then, as things become more valuable, people become more and more willing to kill each other for those substances. So, I mean, I do think that Jocelyn Elders, our former Surgeon General, was correct in that this question of drug legalization needs to be studied. Whether or not it needs to be decriminalized or not, I'm not willing to say, because I would agree with most people who are dealing with this subject that drugs are bad. Drugs harm people, and I mean, I've seen I've seen drugs destroy lives too many times to think that, hey, we just ought to let everybody use all the drugs they want. But at the same time, the system that we have is leading to the criminalization of the black community and the Indian community and poor white communities, but particularly the black and Indian community and Hispanic and Asian communities of people who are oppressed racial minorities. And by and large, these people from these communities are at the absolute bottom of the drug trade. And so the people who are least culpable in the drug trade get the most time, which then begins to look like we're criminalizing people on racial grounds and so forth. And I think that the decision, the State v. Russell decision, rendered by the Minnesota Supreme Court, after trial judge Pam Alexander struck down the sentencing disparity between powder cocaine and rock form cocaine.
So that's what she did, okay.
Yeah, that's what she did. There was a disparity. See, you had upwards of 80 to 90% of all the people being hauled in or charged for powder were white. Similar percentage of people who were being hauled in or charged for rock cocaine were black. And so the court found that there was no chemical difference between the substances. The only difference is in the way people took the drug, and that because there was no differences, that there's no reasonable basis for a difference in the sentences. And as a matter of fact, the sentencing disparity actually was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the state constitution and the federal constitution as well.
What about the fact, because like we were talking about before, how is crack more addictive? I know that you get a much more intense high for a shorter period of time, so it seems more destructive to me than powder cocaine in the short term.
Well, it's something that I think you might want to talk to a chemist about. Okay. Because the fact is, crack itself is not more addictive. Okay. Smoking cocaine might be more addictive than snorting cocaine. Okay. Could be. Okay. But crack is not more addictive than powder cocaine. Okay. Delivery is what we're talking about. And I'm not even certain. I'm not a scientific person. I'm just an plain old lawyer. So I really don't want to speak on whether or not smoking cocaine is more addictive than snorting it or injecting it, but I would venture to guess that they're probably about the same, and that most in the popular mind we certainly think of crack as being worse. But how much of that has to do with what we read in the paper every day and see on the evening news every day?
I know people who've done crack, and they've told me, and they've also done powder cocaine, but it is true they did it differently. They usually snort cocaine, and then they smoke crack, and crack is like the most unbelievable high they'd ever had. It didn't last very long, but then immediately they wanted more. Right. Whereas with cocaine, they wanted more too, but it wasn't the intensity.
Well, you hear those stories, but then again, that's...
But everyone's different. It's true.
But, as much as I respect what you're saying, it still is an anecdote, and there needs some scientific evidence that this is true, and not limited to just the individual person who you talk to, we need to get a control group, and we need to get another group to test this group, test that group, and really be able to come up with something that makes a whole lot of sense. And the truth is, that those kind of studies are out there.
Okay.
They're out there and they're out there and they exist, and it's worthwhile to investigate this matter.
Mhm. Okay. Let's see. Do you think that most people use drugs of some sort, or most people are addicted to something?
No, I would say most people are not addicted to something, but I would have to agree that most people use drugs. You know,
Okay.
I mean,
Okay.
because look, I'm drinking coffee right now. It's a drug.
Uh-huh.
You know, it has caffeine in it, which is a drug. And of course, aspirin's a drug. And when we talk in terms of drugs, we got to talk in terms of drugs that, you know, control substances and drugs. You know, they're all controlled, and that if the government regulates, then they're controlled, right? But usually you think in terms of harmful drugs like cocaine, crack, heroin, you know, and then you're talking about other sorts of drugs, right? All of them need to be controlled because drugs are dangerous and can be if used wrong.
Yeah.
And any substance can be a poison or a medicine depending on which degree, depending on how you use it.
Yeah, that's very true. Something that I think is, I was wondering, let's see, I don't know if you're going to have anything to say about this, but like, wealthy people, well people with money, like a lot of my friends are on antidepressants, so they're always taking Prozac, Zoloft, and all these other things that they can afford to get for their depression.
Right.
And supposedly depression is a real thing, so.
Well, some of it has an organic origin, some of it has a functional origin. You know what I mean? Sometimes people are depressed because of something that a pathologist could find in the brain. Okay, here, I'm looking inside your brain and I see, you know, here that is. Other things that are more functional, they have to do with life circumstances, upbringing, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So not every depressive state is the same.
That's
or has
true.
the same etiology or origin.
Yeah. So, do you think that, like, people with money can take those prescriptions and poor people can't?
Well, poor people can get a hold of Prozac, you know. I mean,
can they? Okay.
Well, I mean, not as easily. You
Yeah.
know, but they can get a hold of it. I mean, I think though that you know, there's you know, I don't know if the issue is who can get drugs and who can't. You know.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that like people with money can get more drugs. Like they can go get Valium, they can get all sorts of things that are legal, whereas poor people don't have as much access to legal drugs.
Well, I would tend to agree that people who are in power and are middle class and acceptable people, they use drugs just like everybody else does, but the society will sanction the drugs that they use to be okay. Whereas people who are viewed to be troublesome populations, poor people, people from racial minorities or nationalities, are more likely to, what they do is more tends to be criminalized more. But that has to do with not only drugs but recreation and everything else. You know, if you're wealthy and you want to go out and hang out and have some recreation, you go to the Minneapolis Athletic Club and you sit back and you toss back some drinks and you laugh and yuck it up with your friends. But if you're poor, you might stand on the corner drinking out of a paper bag, and you're not doing anything different from what those rich folks are doing. But police will certainly come up to you and arrest you or charge you with disorderly conduct or public consumption of alcohol or whatever.
Yeah, because you don't have money.
Certainly, there's a racial disparity there.
Yeah. That's really true.
Not a racial, but an income disparity as well.
Okay. Do you know what drug-free zones are?
They're areas that are designated to be areas in which there's a heightened penalty associated with drug possession or sale in that area. So, for instance, if you're near a school or near a park or anything like that, the penalties for selling or possessing drugs in those areas is greater than if you're not in a drug-free zone.
Okay.
So, for instance, if you're looking at this park right out the street, what's the name of that park out there?
PV Park.
PV Park. You know, you can, I've had cases where a young welfare mother with 2 children was supplementing her income by selling drugs for a drug dealer. You know, She's charged with second-degree sale, faces extremely stiff penalties, in part because she's selling drugs in a park. Of course, the idea behind laws like that is that there's some places that where children are more likely to be, and so forth, and so we've designated them as places where the greater penalties should be associated with dealing drugs in that place. But that's the idea behind it. I tend to think, though, that drug-free zones aren't really the answer. I mean, they certainly don't deter people. I'd like to see some statistical analysis as to whether people are now avoiding drug-free zones to sell drugs in, as opposed to going to the open drug zone. I don't know.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't know. It doesn't make much sense to me.
Yeah.
But it does make sense to me that, you know, people should not be dealing dope in front of, in parks and in around schools.
Yeah.
But how do you deal with the issue? I think is the question. You know, I think it's certainly the question. How do we deal with it? What should our public policy response be? You know, because what we essentially have is a social problem and an economic problem, and we're dealing with it with a criminal justice solution. You understand?
Yeah.
It's almost as if you have a screw with that you want to get into a wall for some reason, and so you have a screwing problem, whereas and all you have is a hammer. You know, you're not using the right tool for this particular challenge. And there may be a need for some sort of criminal justice response in terms of police, courts, and so forth. But what we have now is that ever since the advent of the Reagan era, you know, we've been dealing with social and economic problems with criminal justice solutions. And so what we have now is an absolute explosion of prison population. America has over 1 million people in prison now. That does not count the 455,000 people in jail. And so, you know, America may well have more people in confinement than any other country, although Russia does technically have more people in prison. And that's new. For years, America led the world in a country with that we think of as a totally racist society like South Africa. You know, South Africa does not incarcerate nearly as many black people as America does. South Africa doesn't even incarcerate the same percentage of black people as a matter of population as America does.
Okay.
You know, and so, I mean, people will say, well, America's a bigger country, of course we incarcerate more. No, we incarcerate a greater percentage of the black population than South Africa does. And so I think that tells a lot about what kind of society we live in as well.
Yeah.
How's that answer your question?
Yeah,
I forgot where.
Great. Let's see.
Yeah, for instance, in Minnesota, the number of arrests of African Americans for narcotics crimes rose 500% between 1981 and 1990, almost 17 times as fast as the rise of arrests for whites. You know.
Why do you think? Do you think it's just strictly because the society is really racist and they want black people in jail?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what I believe.
That's what it seems like. I don't understand it.
But there is an income element as well.
Poor, yeah.
Yeah, there's a poverty element as well. Black people tend to be poor more often than white people do, right? So that element exists as well, you know. And so, but it's racist because, you know, look, drugs are everywhere. You can find, if you bust down doors in Edina, you'll find drugs. If you bust down doors in Bloomington, you'll find drugs. If you bust down doors in Phillips neighborhood, you'll find drugs too. So from a criminal justice standpoint, you have to select whose door you're going to bust down. Well, what goes into the calculus?
Yeah.
You know, Bing. I mean, the thing, we live in a society where whites are raised and conditioned from very early ages to think of black people and Indian people and other people from repressed nationalities as less than or more than, depending on what it is. More, if it's bad, more than. If it's good, less than, you know, less moral, you know, more criminal, you know, all these kinds of things. More less deserving of sympathy and consideration, more deserving of harsh treatment. No doubt we have a drug matter going on right there. So my point is that if you know, our criminal justice hierarchy is made up of you know, people with white skin color privilege by and large, and so they're going to sit back and they're going to say, look, if we go busting down doors in Medina, people won't like that. If we go busting down doors in North Minneapolis and Franklin, Chicago, the respectable people will be less concerned. They'll, you know, because they're already conditioned to think of these people a certain way anyway. Yeah. And so we'll just go the path of least resistance. We look like we're doing something, but we're really not doing a damn thing.
Yeah.
So
it's true.
That's the way our criminal justice system is set up, and it really has a lot to do. I mean, the roots of why our society is set up this way go back to 1555, when the first African people were brought here to work for no pay in a state of enslavement. You know, of course, people talk about 1619 as well, but my research indicates an earlier date than that, 64 years earlier than that. So there you go.
Okay. And also, like, you're saying how they choose poor people to break into their house and arrest them.
Get a front-end loader, you know.
Yeah. And do you think that also is because, like, wealthier people can get a lawyer?
That's true.
Can afford more.
That's also true. I mean,
and so then they can get out of it if they're.
Well, poor people have a right to attorneys as well. You know, that has to do with the public defender system.
Yeah.
Under a case called Gideon v. Wainwright, which is a Supreme Court case rendered in the 1960s, all people who are facing incarceration have a right to an attorney. And in Minnesota, that means everybody from misdemeanors on up has a right to a lawyer.
Okay.
But if you have the power to retain an attorney, well, see, certainly you're going to be, you have the economic power to retain an attorney, you're certainly going to be in a more advantageous position, because the public defender is not going to get involved in your case by and large until you've been charged. You understand? So, I mean, as soon as the front end loader breaks the door down, or the raid happens or whatever, you can be on the phone to your lawyer if you can afford one.
Mm-hmm.
But you may not see a lawyer until you're arrested, brought down to the jailhouse. They put on your Hennepin County blues, you know, the little outfits they put on folks, march you up in the courtroom, and then say, hey, there's your lawyer. And then the lawyer has 2 seconds to say, okay, here's my card, and I'll be talking to you soon. And then you know.
And they're really overburdened too.
Oh,
as you were saying
very much overburdened. But I must say that even despite the overburdened situation public defenders are facing, that there are a lot of very courageous, very dedicated public defenders, and they're doing the best they can.
Yeah, I'm sure they are.
Mm-hmm.
I was reading an article that was talking about them. I think it was in New York,
Mm-hmm.
public defenders,
Right.
and that they were trying to get people to say that they were guilty more often than they used to.
Yeah.
Before people would plead not guilty, but now they just want everyone to plead guilty. So they can.
Well, see, that's not only the public defender system. See, because penalties have skyrocketed. See, years ago, I mean, I know from a victim standpoint, people might think they're better off or something. They're really not better off. But years ago, let me put it like this. In 1989 in Minnesota, for instance, all of the penalties for all the crimes were multiplied times 2. You understand? So all the penalties doubled. So if you're talking about 48 months for ag robbery,
Mm-hmm.
first time offense, you know, well, before 1989, it was 24 months.
Oh.
Do you understand?
Yeah.
So they doubled all the penalties in 1989. So
For all criminal.
yeah,
Everything.
right.
So
So the thing is that if somebody comes to me and my lawyer comes to me and says, look, Keith, if you get convicted, you're going to go to prison for 60 months, whereas before you'd have been going to prison for 30 months. That's going to change the way. I mean, it increases the likelihood of a false guilty plea, because people cannot afford to be convicted, because the penalty is so severe. So, you know, that affects the reason why people will plead guilty as well. And, you know, there are situations where a public defender may have to say, I know you said you didn't do it, and I don't believe you did it, but you need to know what you're facing if convicted, right? And I'll represent you no matter what, and I'm on your side, and we'll go to trial and everything. But, you know, we need to talk about the facts of your case. We need to talk about our defenses. We need to talk about everything. But I would be doing you a disservice if at some point in that conversation, hopefully toward the end of that conversation, I don't show you the sentencing guidelines and what you're dealing with. And oftentimes a person will say, look, I didn't do it, but if I plead guilty, I get, you know, probation or whatever. But if I'm convicted, I get some extraordinarily large amount of time in prison. I mean, that's going to affect the way people think, guilty or innocent. Guilty or innocent.
I didn't know that.
And it's a true story. But, you know, people in the legislature don't have any regard for that kind of thing. They could really care less. Most folks assume that if you're arrested, you did it.
Yeah.
You know, whereas an arrest doesn't mean anything at all. You know, most people aren't willing to wait until the facts come out. They're willing. They just want to base their whole thing on, you know, what the paper said. You know, and the first people to give the papers anything are the prosecutors and the government. The defense usually is not going to go respond to everything that the papers say because you don't want to give away your defense strategy.
Okay.
So the only story that the public really hears is what the government has to say about it. And so, you know, people's hearts are already hardened against you before anything happens.
Yeah, it's true. Because I had to go to court once. And the
How'd
police
you find
report
that
was a
experience?
total lie.
Yeah.
They lied. It was amazing because I didn't know.
Who lied?
The police lied.
Oh.
Well,
I was like, what? What does that say? The person, I mean, it was me and my boyfriend. We got in a fight. And I kicked out our window and I was drunk. And they said that the report said I was repeatedly kicking him, which I wasn't doing. So he came down there with me and said, you know, she didn't do that. I don't know where they got that from.
Well, you know, true story is that most police reports are an exercise in creative report writing.
God.
Creative writing. They all with the A's, you know. They all want to take up English, you know what I mean? Comparative lit, you know.
Yeah.
We have a, you know, really, you know what I mean? I think the police department is, you know, just a untapped source of fiction writers. You know, we need to tap
Give them some jobs.
Yeah, the literary talent in this country would like expand exponentially if we all said, okay, now you're going to be a novelist.
Yeah. Yeah, that made me realize that it's not. Because I always thought they'd have, you know, they'd be totally honest and, you know, everything is fair.
Well, of course you'd think that. I mean, let's look at it, you know. You turn on the TV, you know, what comes on? Law and Order. You ever see any bad arrests there? Ever see any police brutality on Law and Order?
Yeah.
Okay, then you flip to the next channel, then we got NYPD Blue. They're tough, but no bad arrests, no lying cops, no police brutality, no unlawful searches, right? Okay, and you probably heard a few things about how he's just going to get out and they're just going to slap him on the wrist and the justice system's a joke, right? You hear all that kind of stuff. All lies, by the way. and then you know, if you were watching TV during the 70s, as I was, you know, you saw Starsky and Hutch. You know, they're tough guys, but good guys. You know, no bad arrests, no police brutality, no racism, no nothing. You know, of course, you know, we start out with Dragnet, the granddaddy of all cop shows. You know, tough guys, but no racism, no brutality, no unlawful searches, no nothing. Just nice guys. And you know, if Sergeant Friday put the cuff on you, you know, you did it. You know, it's just it's the end of it. You know, why do we even need a trial? You know, Sergeant Friday is the guy who made the arrest. You know, to even have a trial is somehow insinuating that somehow that Sergeant Friday is not a perfect person, which we all know that he is. So, you know, the thing is that the police have such a impressive set of media propaganda, you know, that, you know, it's hard for people. I mean, I think it really has eroded the public sense of a presumption of innocence. You know, they really don't. They really think. I think most people think the presumption of innocence is just some liberal idea that kind of lets crooks off the hook. You know, whereas really is the bedrock of this Constitution in terms of the criminal justice. And so, there we go. I mean, why wouldn't we think that all the police are honest? I mean, you never saw how. I mean, other than Rodney King, which people are convinced is just one weird thing that happened and it doesn't go like that. No, Rodney King is the norm.
Yeah.
That's not the aberration center. I mean, you look over here in New York, the Mullen Commission that put out commission that came together to examine police corruption in New York, found the New York Police Department rife with criminality and corruption. And I don't blame the police necessarily, because I mean you're getting very young people off the streets, who maybe go to a 2-year community college, and I'm not putting down community college. I'm all for community college, but we're not talking about highly trained individuals in the ways of human beings. They're trained in shooting that gun, but most of what police do, and I think police will tell you this, is deal with human problems. That's most of what they do. I know cops who've been on the beat their whole lives and never pulled that gun out of the holster. And then of course, like in Minneapolis, where 70% of the police don't live in Minneapolis. You're talking about people who maybe come in from who knows? I don't want to pick on the range, but let's say the range, or let's just say down in the southwest part. Let's say Marshall. They come from Marshall, and then they all come down into Minneapolis, to police. You're talking about a young person who wants some adventure, and thinks that they're gonna kick butt, on the hoodlums who've moved up here from Chicago and Detroit and Gary to sell dope, and their female counterparts who are all here just to suck up welfare from the good white Christians of Minnesota. You understand? And so you start getting this is the mentality that these young cops come into their jobs with. This is how they're thinking. I believe most cops join the force because they want to help, because they've been subjected to the same stuff you and I had. They saw Starsky and Hutch. They want to be like Starsky and Hutch. They think that's what policing is. But they get in there and they learn they learn that there is a culture in every police department, and that culture is very male dominated, very white dominated, very military dominated, very much no self-reflection. Don't look over our shoulders. Don't do like every profession that you want to name has some sort of oversight body. Lawyers have the Lawyers Board of Professional Responsibility. Doctors have probably the same thing. I know they have a counterpart to it. I don't know what the name of it is. Journalists have the media board up there. There's a thing that reviews media stories that journalists do. Everybody has oversight. Everybody more or less expects some oversight, except for the police. They fight civilian oversight tooth and nail, raise questions about whether it even is necessary, constantly undermine it, and just about every police oversight system in this country was brought about as a result of some sort of heinous, egregious police abuse that rallied people to march and rally, and the politicians, as a concession, set up civilian oversight. And that's almost always how it goes. But, that's, I'm speaking in response to how it's difficult, how you made the very important point, I think typifies a lot of people's sentiments, that police might not always be on the up and up, but certainly oftentimes they're not on the up and up. Well, sometimes they are on the up and up, but I think that they're not on the up and up a significant amount of time, far more than I think your average citizen would realize.
Yeah, it's really true. I mean, I know from watching TV that I've had that view. You assume that the police are good, that they're the ones that are right, and you don't even think that they need someone to watch over them.
Yeah, why do we need a courts? Why do we need a civilian oversight at all?
Yeah.
And can I make one more point about that? Well, and then too, I think that there are a significant number of, white middle class suburban people, and of course I'm generalizing, there are exceptions, no question about it, but I think there's a significant number of people who actually kind of regard the police as the people who do their dirty work to a certain extent. And they want the police, they want the police to be a little rougher on those black and brown inner city poverty welfare cheats and dope dealers. That's who they think they are. Because they think that, you know, we want the police to put some fear into them. So if a Rodney King in the minds of some people is not all that bad, even though it's wrong, they're willing to excuse it because it's like, well, look, police, you know, they're up against, you hear this a lot, they have the tough job. You know, we all got tough jobs. What are you talking about? You know, but you'll hear this. And so the police do what they do in my mind and get away with it so often because there are some people, a large number of influential people who want it to happen and who feel a little bit safer when they know that a police officer is willing to go for the violent response than the negotiation response. You know, because they think that we can rule these people through fear.
Yep, set an example for everyone.
Right.
Well, if you get out of line, then
that's what's gonna happen. Right. Rodney King, you know, yeah, he was speeding, but you know, bet you won't speed.
Yeah,
you know,
it's true. It does make you afraid. It makes you afraid of the police.
It makes
if you're black.
But you know, it's interesting. You know, I was going to law school, and at that time, I did a whole lot of marching and rallying and organizing in the area of police brutality. And this is around 1989. And I was in law school one day, and so we happened to have a rally televised, and I happened to be on the idiot box that particular day. And a young white woman comes up to me, you know, sincere person, everything. She said, you know, Keith, I hear you protesting against the police all the time. And I think you believe in what you're doing. But let me tell you, I was stopped by the police just the other day. The belt to my coat was hanging out of my car. The police officer stopped me. Told me, ma'am, your belt's hanging out of your door. You might want to put it in the car. By the way, got to put that safety belt on because you could get hurt. Close the door. Have a nice day. She drives on. She says, that is how I view police. Helpful. Where they have discretion, they'll give you a break. And if you're doing something really bad, then they got to come down on you. But then you understand because most times they're really nice. This is her conception. Yeah. Well, my conception had more to do with the time I was beat up by the police.
Exactly.
You know, called a nigger by the police. You know, this is where I'm coming from. That's where she's coming from. So we live in two separate worlds. She doesn't understand my reality. I don't understand hers because the police really do treat people differently based on who they are.
Yeah, they absolutely do. I have friends that would drive home drunk every single night. I think they lived in St. Louis Park. Never got pulled over. Then I have other friends who live like in this area. We get pulled over all the time. Me and my sister got pulled over for no reason. This cop said, the computer said your car was stolen. We had like the most broken down, beat up car you've ever seen.
Why would anybody want to speak?
Yeah, it was totally ridiculous. He made my sister get out. He like treated us really bad. And I know a lot of other people, if you don't have money also, they treat you bad even if you're white. I think that they pick on black people more because they probably assume.
Because they're conditioned to.
Yeah, exactly. That we're lower.
Yeah, and
also, matter what you do.
And also, you know, I mean, I think that, you know, we're living in a society that is becoming increasingly, you know, dominated by people who have high melanin content, you know? And they, you know, people speak in terms of how America will be a majority of people of color, although I don't like that term, by, you know, some date not too far off in the future. And I think that certain, you know, and then you got the whole angry white male syndrome, right? And I think that people feel like, you know, they're protecting this white skin privilege through the use of police forces, and by extension, you know, through the drug laws. You know, we started out talking about drugs, where now we're kind of talking about police. But I mean, it's good because it's all connected. It's not just the police. It also has to do with probation officers. Also has to do with the courts, judges, legislators who make the laws, and all the way down the line. Yeah. Because people from racial minorities are not fairly represented in any of those areas.
No, that is really true.
How many homeless people are in the legislature?
Yeah, that's true. Do you have an idea of how you think that we can help these drug problems? Like, besides putting people in jail?
Yeah, what we need to do is view drug use as a public health problem. View drug possession as a public health problem. And view drug sales also as a problem, possibly even a criminal justice problem, but also as an economic and social problem that people who from lower economic groups are kind of forced into underground economies because of the lack of availability of reasonable job options. So, I think we need to reorient, the way we conceive of the problem. For instance, I talked about this, this 18-year-old welfare mother selling drugs at PV Park. Well, she should not be selling drugs in PV Park. She should be made aware that she should not sell drugs in PV Park. And the people of the city of Minneapolis don't like it, and we won't have it. But also, we need to look a little bit deeper into the problem. What is it that puts you in that situation in the first place? Does it have anything to do with your condition of poverty? Does it have anything to do with your lack of education? Does it have anything to do with your lack of income to feed your kids and buy Pampers and so forth? Why are you here? And so I think that, we've got to divert a lot of these cases, or almost most of these cases, and divert them from the criminal justice system into a system where people can actually kind of reconstruct their lives to the point where they're going to be able to not do things that would offend the public. Mm-hmm. And when I say offend, I don't mean insult the public through a word. I mean hurt our society, like distribute narcotics. We need to reorient the way we look at it, and I think, we need to conceive of the drug epidemic as an economic problem, as a social problem, and as a health problem. Mm-hmm. I think that much of the drug laws should be reviewed in terms of decriminalization. But I also think that people who are trafficking major amounts of narcotics into the country, I do believe that it's appropriate to deal with them in a way that does have a criminal justice component. Mm-hmm. Because I think you've got to attack the problem at the root of it.
Exactly.
Not these little folks out here, because you don't make a dent in the problem, but you look like you're making a dent in the problem. And I know that people like to watch Cops and Highway Patrol and Rescue 911 and all this stuff that glorify this kind of thing, but those shows are not making you safer, from people who are hooked on dope, And also, I think that the thing to do is to just rechannel resources into human beings, as opposed to maximizing profits and building up the war industry. Yeah. What I'm saying is kind of broad things, but that's where it needs to start. Broadly, philosophically, is where we really need to rechannel our focus. And I have a suspicion that it's only going to be until prison construction is just too expensive that people are going to review our present strategy in dealing with the drug problem. Mm-hmm. But I definitely think that for even a first or second or even third time offender for a low-level drug offense, prison's not the place to be. There may be other places that the person needs to be, but confinement is not the place to be. Another thing, I think it ought to be a condition of release for people in prison to get their GED. I don't think anybody should get out of prison who's going to be there for any length of time should get out with a GED. I think everybody who goes to prison should be evaluated for chemical dependency, and they need to get involved in active drug rehab. So everybody who gets out of prison ought to be clean from drugs and have basic reading and writing and computing skills. These things no doubt will cost money because somebody has to do these things and somebody has to pay for it. Mm-hmm. But we pay tons of money in taxes already, but it doesn't go into things that people really need. You know, how many B-2 bombers or whatever the hell they're making nowadays do we really need? You know, I don't think we need that many. But, you know, the military spends so much money. I was listening to the NPR yesterday, and they said that the military spends more money in about 5 to 10 minutes than the whole National Association for the Arts or whatever does in like a year. You know, this is completely wrong. You know, the calculus should be opposite. You know, and it was interesting that the people were talking about arts in the community actually helps the economy, because I mean, say the symphony is playing or whatever. I don't like symphony music, but let's just use them as an example. People are going to come down to go visit that symphony. Then they might go to a restaurant. Then they might go to might buy some popcorn or whoever. I mean, on the way home, or you know, and you know, it's kind of a magnet for economic activity that revolves around it. So everybody benefits from, say, this thing that now our right-wing representatives in the legislature, federal I'm speaking of now, don't regard as important at all, and are perfectly willing to slice out of the budget. Mm-hmm. And you know, so they can give it to the military, which we don't,
exactly.
which we don't need.
I know.
You know, so
yeah.
there you have it. That's what I think we should do.
Okay, and thinking like about that welfare mom, because I knew a welfare mom and she couldn't work because she couldn't make enough money working. She made more money on welfare because of daycare. Daycare costs so much, and she was a single parent.
Well, if she starts making any money on her own while she's on welfare, she's going to end up in my office with a charge called wrongfully obtaining public assistance.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
You know, so they give her starvation income. Then, when she does something to supplement that income,
to try and bring herself up, exactly.
They charge her with a crime.
Yep. So it's like this vicious. I mean, it's a circle that they want. I think that the system. It seems that they don't want people to get better. They don't want to fight the drug problem. They don't want people to get out of poverty.
Seems like it.
Yeah.
Seems like it, doesn't it?
Yeah. So I do agree with you. Like, as soon as it gets too expensive to build prisons, then they'll start thinking about making some changes.
Maybe we'll do
as soon as it starts affecting their pocketbook.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we'll do something else.
Yep.
But then, you know, like, and you look